The Altair wasn't much, just a $495 pile of parts that had to be soldered to a board that would then do little. But for hobbyists and hackers, it heralded the dawn of a new era. Bill Gates and Paul Allen read the magazine and started working on a version of BASIC, an easy-to-use programming language for the Altair. It also caught the attention of Jobs and Wozniak, and when an Altair kit arrived at the People's Computer Company, it became the centerpiece for the first meeting of the club that French and Moore had decided to launch. The group became known as the Home Brew Computer Club. That night turned out to be one of the most important nights of my life, Wozniak recalled. There was a demonstration of the new Altair, but more important to Wozniak was seeing the specification sheet for a microprocessor. As he thought about the microprocessor, a chip that had an entire central processing unit on it, he had an insight. He had been designing a terminal with a keyboard and a monitor that would connect to a distant mini-computer. Using a microprocessor, he could put some of the capacity of the mini-computer inside the terminal itself, so it could become a small standalone computer on a desktop. It was an enduring idea. Keyboard, screen, and computer all in one integrated personal package. This whole vision of a personal computer just popped into my head, he said. That night, I started to sketch out on paper what would later become known as the Apple I. At first, he planned to use the same microprocessor that was in the Altair, an Intel 8080, but each of those cost almost more than my monthly rent. So he looked for an alternative. He found one in the Motorola 6800, which a friend at HP was able to get for $40 apiece. Then he discovered a chip made by MOS Technologies that was electronically the same but cost only $20. It would make his machine affordable, but it would carry a long-term cost. Intel's chips ended up becoming the industry standard, which would haunt Apple when its computers were incompatible with it. After work each day, Wozniak would go home for a TV dinner and then return to HP to moonlight on his computer. He spread out the parts in his cubicle, figured out their placement, and soldered them onto his motherboard. Then he began writing the software that would get the microprocessor to display images on the screen. Because he could not afford to pay for computer time, he wrote the code by hand. After a couple of months, he was ready to test it. I typed a few keys on the keyboard, and I was shocked. The letters were displayed on the screen. It was Sunday, June 29th, 1975, a milestone for the personal computer. It was the first time in history, Wozniak later said, anyone had typed a character on a keyboard and seen it show up on their own computer's screen right in front of them. Jobs was impressed. He peppered Wozniak with questions. Could the computer ever be networked? Was it possible to add a disk for memory storage? Jobs began to accompany Wozniak to homebrew meetings, carrying the TV monitor and helping to set things up. Woz was usually too shy to talk in the meetings, but people would gather around his machine afterward, and he would proudly show off his progress. The theme of the club, Woz said, was give to help others. It was an expression of the hacker ethic that information should be free and all authority mistrusted. I designed the Apple I because I wanted to give it away for free to other people, said Wozniak. This was not an outlook that Bill Gates embraced. After he and Paul Allen had completed their BASIC interpreter for the Altair, Gates was appalled that members of the homebrew were making copies of it and sharing it without paying him. So he wrote what would become a famous letter to the club. As the majority of hobbyists must be aware, most of you steal your software. Is this fair? One thing you do is prevent good software from being written. Who can afford to do professional work for nothing? I would appreciate letters from anyone who wants to pay up." Steve Jobs similarly did not embrace the notion that Wozniak's creations, be it a blue box or a computer, wanted to be free. "Why don't we build and sell printed circuit boards to them?" It was an example of their symbiosis. "Every time I design something great, Steve would find a way to make money for us," said Wozniak. Jobs knew how to appeal to Wozniak. He didn't argue that they were sure to make money, but instead that they would have a fun adventure. They would start their own computer company. Apple is born. Now that they had decided to start a business, they needed a name. Finally, Jobs proposed Apple Computer. "I was on one of my fruitarian diets," he explained. "I had just come back from the apple farm. It sounded fun, spirited, and not intimidating. Apple took the edge off the word computer. Plus, it would get us ahead of Atari in the phone book." He told Wozniak that if a better name did not hit them by the next afternoon, they would just stick with Apple. And they did. Wozniak was not yet ready to commit full-time. He was an HP company man at heart, or so he thought, and he wanted to keep his day job there. Jobs realized he needed an ally to help corral Wozniak, so he enlisted a friend, Ron Wayne, a middle-aged engineer at Atari who had once started a slot machine company. Woz had a parental attitude toward the circuits he developed, and he wanted to be able to use them in other applications or let HP use them, Wayne said. "Jobs and I realized that these circuits would be the core of Apple. We spent 2 hours in a round-table discussion at my apartment, and I was able to get Woz to accept this. His argument was that a great engineer would be remembered only if he teamed with a great marketer, and this required him to commit his designs to the partnership. Jobs was so impressed and grateful that he offered Wayne a 10% stake in the new partnership, turning him into a tiebreaker if Jobs and Wozniak disagreed over an issue. They were very different, but they made a powerful team," said Wayne. It helped that Jobs was awed by Wozniak's engineering wizardry, and Wozniak was awed by Jobs' business drive. Even after Wozniak became convinced that his new computer design should become the property of the Apple partnership, he felt that he had to offer it first to HP, since he was working there. So he demonstrated it to his managers in the spring of 1976. The senior executive at the meeting was impressed and seemed torn, but he finally said it was not something that HP could develop. "I was disappointed," Wozniak recalled, "but now I was free to enter into the Apple partnership." On April 1st, 1976, Jobs and Wozniak went to Wayne's apartment in Mountain View to draw up the partnership agreement. Wayne then got cold feet. As Jobs started planning to borrow and spend more money, he recalled the failure of his own company. He didn't want to go through that again. So he returned to the Santa Clara County office just 11 days later with a statement of withdrawal and an amendment to the partnership agreement. In payment for his 10% of the company, he received $800 and shortly afterward, $1,500 more. Had he stayed on and kept his 10% stake, at the end of 2010, it would have been worth approximately $2.6 billion. Instead, he was then living alone in a small home in Paw Rump, Nevada, where he played the penny slot machines and lived off his Social Security check. He later claimed he had no regrets. "I made the best decision for me at the time. Both of them were real whirlwinds, and I knew my stomach, and it wasn't ready for such a ride." Jobs and Wozniak took the stage together for a presentation to the Homebrew Computer Club shortly after they signed Apple into existence. The audience was not very impressed. The Apple had a cut-rate microprocessor, not the Intel 8080. But one important person stayed behind to hear more. His name was Paul Terrell, and in 1975 he had opened a computer store which he dubbed the Byte Shop on Camino Real in Menlo Park. Terrell was impressed enough to hand Jobs and Woz his card. "Keep in touch," he said. "I'm keeping in touch," Jobs announced the next day when he walked barefooted into the Byte Shop. He made the sale. Terrell agreed to order 50 computers. But there was a condition. He didn't want just $50 printed circuit boards, for which customers would then have to buy all the chips and do the assembly. Instead, he wanted the boards to be fully assembled. For that, he was willing to pay about $500 apiece, cash on delivery. Jobs immediately called Wozniak at HP. "Are you sitting down?" he asked. Wozniak said he wasn't. Jobs nevertheless proceeded to give him the news. "I was shocked, just completely shocked," Wozniak recalled. "I will never forget that moment." Garage Band. The Jobs house in Los Altos became the assembly point for the 50 Apple I boards that had to be delivered to the Byte Shop within 30 days when the payment for the parts would come due. All available hands were enlisted: Jobs and Wozniak, plus Daniel Kotke, his ex-girlfriend Elizabeth Holmes, who had broken away from the cult she had joined, and Jobs' pregnant sister, Patty. Paul Jobs suspended his sideline of repairing old cars so that the Apple team could have the whole garage. After a dozen assembled boards had been approved by Wozniak, Jobs drove them over to the Byte Shop. Terrell was a bit taken aback. There was no power supply, case, monitor, or keyboard. He had expected something more finished, but Jobs stared him down, and he agreed to take delivery and pay. After 30 days, Apple was on the verge of being profitable. In order to seem like a real company, Jobs hired an answering service which would relay messages to his mother. Ron Wayne drew a logo using the ornate line drawing style of Victorian illustrated fiction that featured Newton sitting under a tree framed by a quote from Wordsworth: "A mind forever voyaging through strange seas of thought alone." It was a rather odd motto, one that fit Wayne's self-image more than Apple Computer. Woz had already begun thinking about the next version of the machine, so they started calling their current model the Apple I. Jobs and Woz would drive up and down Camino Real, trying to get the electronics stores to sell it. By this time, they had other competitors. They all had the chance to go on display during Labor Day weekend of 1976 at the first annual Personal Computer Festival held in a tired hotel on the decaying boardwalk of Atlantic City, New Jersey. Jobs and Wozniak took a TWA flight to Philadelphia, cradling one cigar box with the Apple I and another with the prototype for the successor that Woz was working on. Wozniak spent most of his time in their hotel room tweaking his new prototype. He was too shy to stand at the card table that Apple had been assigned near the back of the exhibition hall. Daniel Kotke had taken the train down from Manhattan, where he was now attending Columbia, and he manned the table while Jobs walked the floor to inspect the competition. What he saw did not impress him. Wozniak, he felt reassured, was the best circuit engineer, and the Apple I, and surely its successor, could beat the competition in terms of functionality. However, the Sol 20 was better looking. It had a sleek metal case, a keyboard, a power supply, and cables. It looked like it had been produced by grown-ups. The Apple I, on the other hand, appeared as scruffy as its creators. The Apple II. Dawn of a New Age. An integrated package. As Jobs walked the floor of the Personal Computer Festival, he came to the realization that Paul Terrell of the Byte Shop had been right. Personal computers should come in a complete package. My vision was to create the first fully packaged computer, he recalled. We were no longer aiming for the handful of hobbyists who liked to assemble their own computers, who knew how to buy transformers and keyboards. For every one of them, there were 1,000 people who would want the machine to be ready to run. In their hotel room on that Labor Day weekend of 1976, Wozniak tinkered with the prototype of the new machine to be named the Apple II that Jobs hoped would take them to this next level. To produce the fully packaged Apple II would require significant capital, so they considered selling the rights to a larger company. In September, Chuck Peddle of the Commodore Computer Company came by the Jobs house to get a demo. We'd opened Steve's garage to the sunlight, and he came in wearing a suit and a cowboy hat, Wozniak recalled. Peddle loved the Apple II, and he arranged a presentation for his top brass a few weeks later at Commodore headquarters. "You might want to buy us for a few $100,000, Jobs said when they got there. Wozniak was stunned by this ridiculous suggestion, but Jobs persisted. The Commodore honchos called a few days later to say they had decided it would be cheaper to build their own machine. The Commodore flirtation brought to the surface a potential conflict between Jobs and Wozniak. Were they truly equal in what they contributed to Apple and what they should get out of it? Jerry Wozniak, who exalted the value of engineers over mere entrepreneurs and marketers, thought most of the money should be going to his son. He confronted Jobs personally when he came by the Wozniak house. "You don't deserve shit," he told Jobs. "You haven't produced anything." Jobs began to cry, which was not unusual. He had never been and would never be adept at containing his emotions. He told Steve Wozniak that he was willing to call off the partnership. "If we're not 50-50, he said to his friend, "you can have the whole thing." Wozniak, however, understood better than his father the symbiosis they had. If it had not been for Jobs, he might still be handing out schematics of his boards for free at the back of homebrew meetings. It was Jobs who had turned his ingenious designs into a budding business, just as he had with the blue box. He agreed they should remain partners. It was a smart call. To make the Apple II successful required more than just Wozniak's awesome circuit design. It would need to be packaged into a fully integrated consumer product, and that was Jobs' role. While haunting the appliance aisles at Macy's, he was struck by the Cuisinart food processors and decided that he wanted a sleek case made of light molded plastic. At a homebrew meeting, he offered a local consultant, Jerry Manick, $1,500 to produce such a design. Within weeks, Manick had produced a simple foam-molded plastic case that was uncluttered and exuded friendliness. Jobs was thrilled. Next came the power supply. Digital geeks like Wozniak paid little attention to something so analog and mundane, but Jobs decided it was a key component. In particular, he wanted, as he would his entire career, to provide power in a way that avoided the need for a fan. Fans inside computers were not Zen-like. They distracted. He dropped by Atari to consult with chief engineer Al Alcorn, who knew old-fashioned electrical engineering. Al turned me on to this brilliant guy named Rod Holt, who was a chain-smoking Marxist who had been through many marriages and was an expert on everything, Jobs recalled. "He just conned me into working," said Holt, who ended up joining Apple full-time. Instead of a conventional linear power supply, Holt built one like those used in oscilloscopes. It switched the power on and off not 60 times per second, but thousands of times. This allowed it to store the power for far less time and thus throw off less heat. That switching power supply was as revolutionary as the Apple II logic board was, Jobs later said. Jobs's father had once taught him that a drive for perfection meant caring about the craftsmanship even of the parts unseen. Jobs applied that to the layout of the circuit board inside the Apple II. He rejected the initial design because the lines were not straight enough. This passion for perfection led him to indulge his instinct to control. Most hackers and hobbyists like to customize, modify, and jack various things into their computers. To Jobs, this was a threat to a seamless end-to-end user experience. Wozniak, a hacker at heart, disagreed. He wanted to include 8 slots on the Apple II for users to insert whatever smaller circuit boards and peripherals they might want. Wozniak won the argument that time, but he could sense his power waning. I was in a position to do that then. I wouldn't always be. Mike Markkula. All of this required money. The tooling of this plastic case was going to cost like $100,000, Jobs said. Just to get this whole thing into production was going to be like $200,000. He went to Nolan Bushnell, the owner of Atari. He asked me if I would put $50,000 in, and he would give me a third of the company, said Bushnell. I was so smart, I said no. It's kind of fun to think about that when I'm not crying. Bushnell suggested that Jobs try Don Valentine, a straight-shooting former marketing manager at National Semiconductor who had founded Sequoia Capital, a pioneering venture capital firm. Valentine arrived at the Jobses' garage in a Mercedes wearing a blue suit, button-down shirt, and rep tie. Steve was trying to be the embodiment of the counterculture. He had a wispy beard, was very thin, and looked like Ho Chi Minh. What bothered him more was that Jobs knew nothing about marketing and seemed content to peddle his product to individual stores one by one. If you want me to finance you, Valentine told him, you need to have one person as a partner who understands marketing and distribution and can write a business plan. Send me 3 suggestions, Jobs replied. Valentine did. Jobs met them, and he clicked with one of them, a man named Mike Markkula, who would end up playing a critical role at Apple for the next 2 decades. Markkula was only 33, but he had already retired after working at Fairchild and then Intel, where he made millions on his stock options when the chipmaker went public. He was a cautious and shrewd man, with the precise moves of someone who had been a gymnast in high school, and he excelled at figuring out pricing strategies, distribution networks, marketing, and finance. When I arrived at the garage, Woz was at the workbench and immediately began showing off the Apple II, Markkula recalled. I looked past the fact that both guys needed a haircut and was amazed by what I saw on that workbench. You can always get a haircut. Jobs immediately liked Markkula. He also struck Jobs as decent and fair. You could tell that if he could screw you, he wouldn't. He had a real moral sense to him. Wozniak was equally impressed. I thought he was the nicest person ever, he recalled. Better still, he actually liked what we had. Markkula proposed to Jobs that they write a business plan together. If it comes out well, I'll invest, Markkula said, and if not, you've got a few weeks of my time for free. Markkula ended up writing most of the plan. Markkula's plan envisioned ways of getting beyond the hobbyist market. He talked about introducing the computer to regular people in regular homes, doing things like keeping track of your favorite recipes or balancing your checkbook, Wozniak recalled. Markkula offered to guarantee a line of credit of up to $250,000 in return for being made a 1/3 equity participant. The 3 met in the cabana by Markkula's swimming pool and sealed the deal. I thought it was unlikely that Mike would ever see that $250,000 again, and I was impressed that he was willing to risk it, Jobs recalled. Now it was necessary to convince Wozniak to come on board full-time. "Why can't I keep doing this on the side and just have HP as my secure job for life?" he asked. Markkula said that wouldn't work, and he gave him a deadline of a few days to decide. "I'd decided long ago that I would never become someone authoritative." Markkula shrugged and said, "Okay." But Jobs got very upset. He cajoled Wozniak. He got friends to try to convince him. He cried, yelled, and threw a couple of fits. Then Alan Baum, their prankster mate at Homestead High, called. He argued that if Wozniak joined Apple full-time, he would not have to go into management or give up being an engineer. "That was exactly what I needed to hear," Wozniak later said. On January 3, 1977, the new corporation, the Apple Computer Company, was officially created, and it bought out the old partnership that had been formed by Jobs and Wozniak 9 months earlier. Markkula would become a father figure to Jobs. "Mike really took me under his wing," Jobs recalled. "He emphasized that you should never start a company with the goal of getting rich. Your goal should be making something you believe in and making a company that will last." Markkula wrote his principles in a one-page paper titled The Apple Marketing Philosophy that stressed 3 points. The first was empathy, an intimate connection with the feelings of the customer. We will truly understand their needs better than any other company. The second was focus. In order to do a good job of those things that we decide to do, we must eliminate all of the unimportant opportunities. The third, and equally important principle, awkwardly named, was impute. It emphasized that people form an opinion about a company or product based on the signals that it conveys. "People do judge a book by its cover," he wrote. For the rest of his career, Jobs would understand the needs and desires of customers better than any other business leader. He would focus on a handful of core products, and he would care, sometimes obsessively, about marketing and image and even the details of packaging. "When you open the box of an iPhone or iPad, we want that tactile experience to set the tone for how you perceive the product," he said. "Mike taught me that." Regis McKenna. The first step in this process was convincing the Valley's premier publicist, Regis McKenna, to take on Apple as a client. McKenna and Jobs hit it off, and McKenna's team got to work on brochures for the Apple II. The first thing they did was to replace Ron Wayne's ornate Victorian woodcut-style logo, which ran counter to McKenna's colorful and playful advertising style. So an art director, Rob Janoff, was assigned to create a new one. "Don't make it cute," Jobs ordered. Janoff came up with a simple apple shape in 2 versions, one whole and the other with a bite taken out of it. The first looked too much like a cherry, so Jobs chose the one with a bite. He also picked a version that was striped in 6 colors, with psychedelic hues sandwiched between whole earth green and sky blue, even though that made printing the logo significantly more expensive. Atop the brochure, McKenna put a maxim, often attributed to Leonardo da Vinci, that would become the defining precept of Jobs' design philosophy. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. The first launch event. The introduction of the Apple II was scheduled to coincide with the first West Coast Computer Fair to be held in April 1977 in San Francisco. Jobs secured a location right at the front of the hall as a dramatic way to launch the Apple. It was an application of Markkula's admonition that it was important to impute your greatness by making a memorable impression on people, especially when launching a new product. That was reflected in the care that Jobs took with Apple's display area. The Apple II looked solid yet friendly in its sleek beige case, unlike the intimidating metal-clad machines and naked boards on the other tables. Apple got 300 orders at the show. Mike Scott. Apple was now a real company, with a dozen employees, a line of credit, and the daily pressures that can come from customers and suppliers. It had even moved out of the Jobs' garage, finally, into a rented office on Stevens Creek Boulevard in Cupertino, about a mile from where Jobs and Wozniak went to high school. Jobs did not wear his growing responsibilities gracefully. He became increasingly tyrannical and sharp in his criticism, according to Markkula. He would tell people, "That design looks like shit." There was also the issue of his hygiene. He was still convinced, against all evidence, that his vegan diets meant that he didn't need to use a deodorant or take regular showers. We would have to literally put him out the door and tell him to go take a shower, said Markkula. At meetings, we had to look at his dirty feet. Sometimes, to relieve stress, he would soak his feet in the toilet, a practice that was not as soothing for his colleagues. Markkula was averse to confrontation, so he decided to bring in a president, Mike Scott, to keep a tighter rein on Jobs. On paper, he looked like a great choice. He was running a manufacturing line for National Semiconductor, and he had the advantage of being a manager who fully understood engineering. In person, however, he had some quirks. He was overweight, afflicted with tics and health problems, and so tightly wound that he wandered the halls with clenched fists. He also could be argumentative. Jobs' desire for control and disdain for authority were destined to be a problem with the man who was brought in to be his regent, especially when Jobs discovered that Scott was one of the only people he had yet encountered who would not bend to his will. Jobs said later, "I never yelled at anyone more than I yelled at Scotty." But for the time being, the personality clashes were manageable, mainly because the company was doing so well. The Apple II would be marketed in various models for the next 16 years, with close to 6 million sold. More than any other machine, it launched the personal computer industry. Wozniak deserves the historic credit for the design of its awe-inspiring circuit board and related operating software, which was one of the era's great feats of solo invention. But Jobs was the one who integrated Wozniak's boards into a friendly package, from the power supply to the sleek case. He also created the company that sprang up around Wozniak's machines. As Regis McKenna later said, Woz designed a great machine, but it would be sitting in hobby shops today were it not for Steve Jobs. Nevertheless, most people considered the Apple II to be Wozniak's creation. That would spur Jobs to pursue the next great advance, one that he could call his own. Chrisanne and Lisa. He who is abandoned. Ever since they had lived together in a cabin during the summer after he graduated from high school, Chrisanne Brennan had woven in and out of Jobs' life. When he returned from India in 1974, they spent time together at Robert Friedland's farm. "Steve invited me up there, and we were just young and easy and free," she recalled. "There was an energy there that went to my heart." When they moved back to Los Altos, their relationship drifted into being, for the most part, merely friendly. By early 1975, she had begun a relationship with a mutual friend, Greg Calhoun. She was with Greg, but went back to Steve occasionally, according to Elizabeth Holmes. "That was pretty much the way it was with all of us. We were sort of shifting back and forth. It was the 70s, after all." In the summer of 1977, Brennan lived for a while in a tent on the grounds of Coban Chino's Zen Center. By this time, Jobs had moved out of his parents' house and was renting a $600 per month suburban ranch house in Cupertino with Daniel Kotke. It was an odd scene of free-spirited hippie types living in a tract house they dubbed Rancho Suburbia. Even though her relationship with Jobs was sporadic, Brennan soon moved in as well. Living in the house at times rekindled the physical relationship between Brennan and Jobs, and within a few months she was pregnant. I wasn't sure it was my kid because I was pretty sure I wasn't the only one she was sleeping with, he told me later. She and I were not really even going out when she got pregnant. She just had a room in our house. Brennan had no doubt that Jobs was the father. There was no discussion of marriage. I knew that she was not the person I wanted to marry, and we would never be happy, and it wouldn't last long, Jobs later said. I was all in favor of her getting an abortion, but she didn't know what to do. Interestingly, given his own background, he was adamantly against one option. He strongly discouraged me putting the child up for adoption, she said. There was a disturbing irony. Jobs and Brennan were both 23, the same age that Joanne Shabel and Abdul Fattah Jandali had been when they had Jobs. I didn't know then about this coincidence of our ages, so it didn't affect my discussions with Chris Ann, he later said. When I did find out that he was 23 when he got Joanne pregnant with me, I thought, whoa. Robert Friedland came to her rescue. He heard that I was pregnant, and he said to come on up to the farm to have the baby, she recalled. So I did. On May 17, 1978, Brennan gave birth to a baby girl. 3 days later, Jobs flew up to be with them and helped name the new baby. The practice on the commune was to give children Eastern spiritual names, but Jobs insisted that she had been born in America and ought to have a name that fit. Brennan agreed. They named her Lisa Nicole Brennan, not giving her the last name Jobs. And then he left to go back to work at Apple. He didn't want to have anything to do with her or with me, said Brennan. She and Lisa moved to a tiny, dilapidated house in back of a home in Menlo Park. They lived on welfare because Brennan did not feel up to suing for child support. Finally, the county of San Mateo sued Jobs to try to prove paternity and get him to take financial responsibility. A year after Lisa was born, Jobs agreed to take a paternity test. The results were pretty dispositive. Probability of paternity is 94.41%, the report read. The California courts ordered Jobs to start paying $385 a month in child support, sign an agreement admitting paternity, and reimburse the county $5,856 in back welfare payments. He was given visitation rights, but for a long time didn't exercise them. Years later, Jobs was remorseful for the way he behaved, one of the few times in his life he admitted as much. I wish I had handled it differently. I could not see myself as a father then, so I didn't face up to it. But when the test results showed she was my daughter, it's not true that I doubted it. I agreed to support her until she was 18 and give some money to Chris Ann as well. I tried to do the right thing, but if I could do it over, I would do a better job. Once the case was resolved, Jobs began to move on with his life, maturing in some respects, though not all. He put aside drugs, eased away from being a strict vegan, and cut back the time he spent on Zen retreats. He began getting stylish haircuts and buying suits and shirts from the upscale San Francisco haberdashery Wilkes Bashford. And he settled into a serious relationship with one of Regis McKenna's employees, a beautiful Polynesian Polish woman named Barbara Jasinski. There was still, to be sure, a childlike rebellious streak in him. He, Jasinski, and Kotke liked to go skinny dipping in Felt Lake on the edge of Interstate 280 near Stanford, and he bought a 1966 BMW R62 motorcycle that he adorned with orange tassels on the handlebars. He could also still be bratty. He belittled waitresses and frequently returned food with the proclamation that it was garbage. At the company's first Halloween party in 1979, he dressed in robes as Jesus Christ, an act of semi-ironic self-awareness that he considered funny, but that caused a lot of eye-rolling. Even his initial stirrings of domesticity had some quirks. He bought a proper house in the Los Gatos Hills, which he adorned with a Maxfield Parrish painting, a Braun coffee maker, and Henkel's knives. But because he was so obsessive when it came to selecting furnishings, it remained mostly barren, lacking beds or chairs or couches. Instead, his bedroom had a mattress in the center, framed pictures of Einstein and Maharaji on the walls, and an Apple II on the floor. Xerox and Lisa. Graphical User Interfaces. A new baby. The Apple II took the company from Jobs' garage to the pinnacle of a new industry. But Jobs was restless. The Apple II could not remain successful forever, and he knew that no matter how much he had done to package it, from power cord to case, it would always be seen as Wozniak's masterpiece. He needed his own machine. At first he hoped that the Apple III would play that role. Indulging his passion for industrial design, Jobs decreed the size and shape of the external case, and he refused to let anyone alter it, even as committees of engineers added more components to the circuit boards. The result was piggybacked boards with poor connectors that frequently failed. When the Apple III began shipping in May 1980, it flopped. Then he and Apple hired 2 engineers from Hewlett-Packard to conceive a totally new computer. The name Jobs chose for it would have caused even the most jaded psychiatrist to do a double take: the Lisa. "We had to come up with an acronym so that we could claim it was not named after Lisa the child," said Andrea Cunningham, who worked at Regis McKenna. The one they reverse engineered was Local Integrated Systems Architecture. Years later, when I asked about the name, Jobs admitted simply, "Obviously, it was named for my daughter." Without the wizardry of Wozniak, who was still working quietly on the Apple II, the engineers began producing a straightforward computer with a conventional text display, unable to push the powerful microprocessor to do much exciting stuff. Jobs began to grow impatient with how boring it was turning out to be. There was, however, one programmer who was infusing the project with some life: Bill Atkinson. He was a doctoral student in neuroscience who had experimented with his fair share of acid. When he was asked to come work for Apple, he declined. But then Apple sent him a non-refundable plane ticket, and he decided to use it and let Jobs try to persuade him. "We are inventing the future," Jobs told him at the end of a 3-hour pitch. "Think about surfing on the front edge of a wave. It's really exhilarating. Now think about dog paddling at the tail end of that wave. It wouldn't be anywhere near as much fun. Come down here and make a dent in the universe." Atkinson did. By the fall of 1979, Apple was breeding 3 ponies to be potential successors to the Apple II workhorse. There was the ill-fated Apple III, there was the Lisa project, which was beginning to disappoint Jobs, and somewhere off Jobs' radar screen, at least for the moment, there was a small skunkworks project for a low-cost machine that was being developed by a colorful employee named Jeff Raskin, a former professor who had taught Bill Atkinson. Raskin's goal was to make an inexpensive computer for the masses that would be like an appliance, a self-contained unit with computer, keyboard, monitor, and software all together, and have a graphical interface. He tried to turn his colleagues at Apple onto a cutting-edge research center right in Palo Alto that was pioneering such ideas. The Xerox Corporation's Palo Alto Research Center, known as Xerox PARC, had been established in 1970 to create a spawning ground for digital ideas. Among its visionaries was the scientist Alan Kay, who had two great maxims that Jobs embraced. The best way to predict the future is to invent it, and people who are serious about software should make their own hardware. Kay pushed the vision of a small personal computer, dubbed the Dynabook, that would be easy enough for children to use. So Xerox PARC's engineers began to develop user-friendly graphics. The metaphor they came up with was that of a desktop. The screen could have many documents and folders on it, and you could use a mouse to point and click on the one you wanted to use. Jeff Raskin decided that these features were the future of computing, so he began urging Jobs and other Apple colleagues to go check out Xerox PARC. What Raskin didn't know was that Xerox's venture capital division wanted to be part of the second round of Apple financing during the summer of 1979. Jobs made an offer. "I will let you invest $1 million in Apple if you will open the kimono at PARC." Xerox accepted. It agreed to show Apple its new technology and in return got to buy 100,000 shares at about $10 each. By the time Apple went public a year later, Xerox's $1 million worth of shares were worth $17.6 million. But Apple got the better end of the bargain. When the Apple folks saw the user-friendly graphics at Xerox PARC, Jobs kept saying that he couldn't believe that Xerox had not commercialized the technology. "You're sitting on a gold mine," he shouted. "It was like a veil being lifted from my eyes," Jobs recalled. "I could see what the future of computing was destined to be." It was the breakthrough he had been looking for, bringing computers to the people with the cheerful but affordable design of an Eichler home and the ease of use of a sleek kitchen appliance. Great artists steal. The Apple raid on Xerox PARC is sometimes described as one of the biggest heists in the chronicles of industry. Jobs occasionally endorsed this view with pride. As he once said, "Picasso had a saying, 'Good artists copy, great artists steal,' and we have always been shameless about stealing great ideas." Another assessment, also sometimes endorsed by Jobs, is that what transpired was less a heist by Apple than a fumble by Xerox. "They were copier heads who had no clue about what a computer could do," he said of Xerox's management. "Xerox could have owned the entire computer industry." Both assessments contain a lot of truth, but there is more to it than that. Jobs and his engineers significantly improved the graphical interface ideas they saw at Xerox PARC, and then were able to implement them in ways that Xerox never could accomplish. For example, one of Atkinson's amazing feats, which we are so accustomed to nowadays that we rarely marvel at it, was to allow the windows on a screen to overlap. Atkinson made it possible to move these windows around, just like shuffling papers on a desk, with those below becoming visible or hidden as you move the top ones. Atkinson and Jobs became best friends for a while, eating together at the Good Earth most nights. But John Couch and the other professional engineers on his Lisa team, many of them buttoned-down HP types, resented Jobs's meddling and were infuriated by his frequent insults. There was a tug-of-war between people like me, who wanted a lean machine, and those from HP like Couch, who were aiming for the corporate market, Jobs recalled. Both Mike Scott and Mike Markkula were intent on bringing some order to Apple and became increasingly concerned about Jobs's disruptive behavior. So in September 1980, they secretly plotted a reorganization. Couch was made the undisputed manager of the Lisa division. Jobs lost control of the computer he had named after his daughter. He was also stripped of his role as Vice President for Research and Development. He was made non-executive chairman of the board. This position allowed him to remain Apple's public face, but it meant that he had no operating control. That hurt. "I was upset and felt abandoned by Markkula," he said. "He and Scotty felt I wasn't up to running the Lisa division. I brooded about it a lot." Going public. A man of wealth and fame. When Mike Markkula joined Jobs and Wozniak to turn their fledgling partnership into the Apple Computer Company in January 1977, they valued it at $5,309. Less than 4 years later, they decided it was time to take it public. It would become the most oversubscribed initial public offering since that of Ford Motors in 1956. By the end of December 1980, Apple would be valued at $1.79 billion. Yes, billion. In the process, it would make 300 people millionaires. Daniel Kotke was not one of them. The official reason he wasn't given stock options was that he was an hourly technician, not a salaried engineer, which was the cutoff level for options. Even so, he could have justifiably been given founder's stock, but Jobs decided not to. Wozniak, not surprisingly, had the opposite attitude. Before the shares went public, he decided to sell, at a very low price, 2,000 of his options to 40 different mid-level employees. Most of his beneficiaries made enough to buy a home. He also later gave shares outright to employees he felt had been shortchanged, including Kotke. Apple went public the morning of December 12, 1980. At age 25, Jobs was now worth $256 million. 30 years after Apple went public, he reflected on what it was like to come into money suddenly. "I never worried about money. I was voluntarily poor when I was in college in India, and I lived a pretty simple life even when I was working. So I went from fairly poor, which was wonderful because I didn't have to worry about money, to being incredibly rich, when I also didn't have to worry about money. I watched people at Apple who made a lot of money and felt they had to live differently. Some of them bought a Rolls-Royce and various houses, each with a house manager and then someone to manage the house managers. Their wives got plastic surgery and turned into these bizarre people. That was not how I wanted to live. It's crazy. I made a promise to myself that I'm not going to let this money ruin my life." He was not particularly philanthropic. His biggest personal gift was to his parents, Paul and Clara Jobs, to whom he gave about $750,000 worth of stock. They sold some to pay off the mortgage on their Los Altos home, and their son came over for the little celebration. "It was the first time in their lives they didn't have a mortgage," Jobs recalled. "They had a handful of their friends over for the party, and it was really nice. Their only splurge was to take a princess cruise each year." With Apple's success came fame to its poster boy. Inc. became the first magazine to put him on its cover in October 1981. Time followed in February 1982 with a package on young entrepreneurs. Despite his new fame and fortune, he still fancied himself a child of the counterculture. Later, Jobs would complain about the new generation of kids who seemed to him more materialistic and careerist than his own. "When I went to school, it was right after the 60s, and before this general wave of practical purposefulness had set in," he said. "Now students aren't even thinking in idealistic terms, or at least nowhere near as much." His generation, he said, was different. "The idealistic wind of the 60s is still at our backs, though, and most of the people I know who are my age have that ingrained in them forever." The Mac is born. You say you want a revolution? Jeff Raskin's Baby. Jeff Raskin was the type of character who could enthrall Steve Jobs or annoy him. As it turned out, he did both. A philosophical guy who could be both playful and ponderous, Raskin had studied computer science, taught music and visual arts, conducted a chamber opera company, and organized guerrilla theater. One of Raskin's dreams was to build an inexpensive computer for the masses, and in 1979 he convinced Mike Markkula to put him in charge of a small development project codenamed Annie to do just that. Since Raskin thought it was sexist to name computers after women, he redubbed the project in honor of his favorite type of apple. The proposed computer became known as the Macintosh. Raskin envisioned a machine that would sell for $1,000 and be a simple appliance with screen and keyboard and computer all in one unit. Throughout 1979 and early 1980, the Macintosh project led a tenuous existence. Every few months it would almost get killed off, but each time Raskin managed to cajole Markkula into granting clemency. The star of the team was a blonde, cherubic, and psychologically intense self-taught young engineer named Burl Smith, who worshipped the code work of Wozniak and tried to pull off similar dazzling feats. Jobs was enthralled by Raskin's vision, but not by his willingness to make compromises to keep down the cost. Thus, they were destined to clash. Some on the team found Jobs impossible to work with, but many others realized that despite his temperamental failings, Jobs had the charisma and corporate clout that would lead them to make a dent in the universe. Jobs told the staff that Raskin was just a dreamer, whereas he was a doer and would get the Mac done in a year. Jobs asserted his control of the group by canceling a brown bag lunch seminar that Raskin was scheduled to give to the whole company in February 1981. That incident led Raskin to write a blistering memo to Apple's president, Mike Scott. It was titled, "Working for/with Steve Jobs," and in it, Raskin asserted, "He is a dreadful manager. I have always liked Steve, but I have found it impossible to work for him. Very often, when told of a new idea, he will immediately attack it and say that it is worthless or even stupid and tell you that it was a waste of time to work on it. This alone is bad management. But if the idea is a good one, he will soon be telling people about it as though it was his own." That afternoon, Scott called in Jobs and Raskin for a showdown in front of Markkula. Jobs started crying. He and Raskin agreed on only one thing: neither could work for the other one. Raskin was told to take a leave of absence. "They wanted to humor me and give me something to do, which was fine," Jobs recalled. "It was like going back to the garage for me. I had my own ragtag team, and I was in control." Raskin's ouster may not have seemed fair, but it ended up being good for the Macintosh. Texaco Towers. A few days after Raskin left, Jobs appeared at the cubicle of Andy Hertzfeld, a young engineer on the Apple II team who had a cherubic face and impish demeanor similar to his pal Burl Smith's. "Are you any good?" Jobs asked the moment he walked in. "We only want really good people working on the Mac, and I'm not sure you're good enough." Hertzfeld knew how to answer. I told him that, yes, I thought I was pretty good. Later that afternoon, he looked up to see Jobs peering over the wall of his cubicle. "I've got good news for you," he said. "You're working on the Mac team now. Come with me." Hertzfeld replied that he needed a couple more days to finish the Apple II product he was in the middle of. "Who cares about the Apple II? The Apple II will be dead in a few years. The Macintosh is the future of Apple, and you're going to start on it now." With that, Jobs yanked out the power cord to Hertzfeld's Apple II, causing the code he was working on to vanish. Jobs' primary test for recruiting people in the spring of 1981 to be part of his merry band of pirates was making sure they had a passion for the product. In order to make the project his own, Jobs decided it should no longer be codenamed after Raskin's favorite apple. So one day Jobs decreed that henceforth the Macintosh should be known instead as the bicycle. This did not go over well. Within a month, the idea was dropped. By early 1981, the Mac team had grown to about 20, and Jobs decided that they should have bigger quarters. So he moved everyone to the second floor of a brown shingled 2-story building about 3 blocks from Apple's main offices. It was next to a Texaco station and thus became known as Texaco Towers. Jobs' triumph was soon complete. A few weeks after winning his power struggle with Raskin to run the Mac division, he helped push out Mike Scott as Apple's president. So Markkula took over as an interim and rather passive president, and Jobs found that he now had full reign to do what he wanted with the Mac division. The reality distortion field. Playing by his own set of rules. When Andy Hertzfeld joined the Macintosh team, he got a briefing from Bud Tribble, the other software designer, about the huge amount of work that still needed to be done. Jobs wanted it finished by January 1982, less than a year away. "That's crazy," Hertzfeld said. "There's no way." Tribble said that Jobs would not accept any contrary facts. "The best way to describe the situation is a term from Star Trek," Tribble explained. "Steve has a reality distortion field." When Hertzfeld looked puzzled, Tribble elaborated. "In his presence, reality is malleable. He can convince anyone of practically anything. It wears off when he's not around, but it makes it hard to have realistic schedules." At first, Hertzfeld thought that Tribble was exaggerating, but after 2 weeks of working with Jobs, he became a keen observer of the phenomenon. To some people, calling it a reality distortion field was just a clever way to say that Jobs tended to lie. But it was, in fact, a more complex form of dissembling. He would assert something, be it a fact about world history or a recounting of who suggested an idea at a meeting, without even considering the truth. "He reminded me of Rasputin," said Debbie Coleman, an early Macintosh team manager. "He laser beamed in on you and didn't blink. It didn't matter if he was serving purple Kool-Aid. You drank it. You did the impossible because you didn't realize it was impossible." At the root of the reality distortion was Jobs' belief that the rules didn't apply to him. He thinks there are a few people who are special, people like Einstein and Gandhi and the gurus he met in India, and he's one of them, said Hertzfeld. Even in small, everyday rebellions, such as not putting a license plate on his car and parking it in handicapped spaces, he acted as if he were not subject to the strictures around him. Another key aspect of Jobs' worldview was his binary way of categorizing things. People were either enlightened or an asshole. Their work was either the best or totally shitty. So in dealing with him, the Mac team adopted an audio concept called a low-pass filter. After a few cycles of him taking alternating extreme positions, said Hertzfeld, we would learn to low-pass filter his signals and not react to the extremes. There were some upsides to Jobs' demanding and wounding behavior. People who were not crushed ended up being stronger. The Mac team knew that. Every year, beginning in 1981, it gave out an award to the person who did the best job of standing up to him. Joanna Hoffman won the first year. From an Eastern European refugee family, she had a strong temper and will. One day, for example, she discovered that Jobs had changed her marketing projections in a way she found totally reality distorting. Furious, she marched to his office. As I'm climbing the stairs, I told his assistant, I am going to take a knife and stab it into his heart, she recounted. Al Eisenstadt, the corporate counsel, came running out to restrain her. but Steve heard me out and backed down. The result was that the Macintosh team came to share Jobs' passion for making a great product, not just a profitable one. He once took the team to see an exhibit of Tiffany glass at the Metropolitan Museum in Manhattan because he believed they could learn from Louis Tiffany's example of creating great art that could be mass-produced. Recalled Bud Tribble, "We said to ourselves, hey, if we're going to make things in our lives, we might as well make them beautiful." Was all of his stormy and abusive behavior necessary? Steve's contributions could have been made without so many stories about him terrorizing folks, Wozniak said. But even though Jobs' style could be demoralizing, it could also be oddly inspiring. It infused in Apple employees an abiding passion to create groundbreaking products and a belief that they could accomplish what seemed impossible. They had T-shirts made that read, "90 hours a week and loving it." He would shout at a meeting, "You asshole, you never do anything right," Debbie Coleman recalled. It was like an hourly occurrence. Yet, I consider myself the absolute luckiest person in the world to have worked with him. The design. Real artists simplify. Unlike most kids who grew up in Eichler homes, Jobs knew what they were and why they were so wonderful. He liked the notion of simple and clean modernism produced for the masses. His fondness for the dark industrial look of Sony receded around June 1981 when he began attending the annual International Design Conference in Aspen. In Aspen, he was exposed to the spare and functional design philosophy of the Bauhaus movement, which taught that design should be simple, yet have an expressive spirit. He repeatedly emphasized that Apple's products would be clean and simple. "We will make them bright and pure and honest about being high-tech, rather than a heavy industrial look of black, 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 like Sony," he preached. Apple's design mantra would remain the one featured on its first brochure. Simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Jobs felt that design simplicity should be linked to making products easy to use. For example, he extolled the desktop metaphor he was creating for the Macintosh. If you walk into an office, there are papers on the desk. The one on the top is the most important. Part of the reason we model our computers on metaphors like the desktop is that we can leverage this experience people already have. As Jobs' design sensibilities evolved, he became particularly attracted to the Japanese style and began hanging out with its stars, such as Issey Miyake and I.M. Pei. His Buddhist training was a big influence. "I have always found Buddhism, Japanese Zen Buddhism in particular, to be aesthetically sublime," he said. "The most sublime thing I've ever seen are the gardens around Kyoto." Like a Porsche. Jeff Raskin's vision for the Macintosh was that it would be like a boxy carry-on suitcase, which would be closed by flipping up the keyboard over the front screen. When Jobs took over the project, he decided to sacrifice portability for a distinctive design that wouldn't take up much space on a desk. He plopped down a phone book and declared to the horror of the engineers that it shouldn't have a footprint larger than that. So his design team of Jerry Manick and Terry Oyama began working on ideas that had the screen above the computer box with a keyboard that was detachable. Oyama drafted a preliminary design and had a plaster model made. The Mac team gathered around for the unveiling and expressed their thoughts. Hertzfeld called it cute. Others also seemed satisfied. Then Jobs let loose a blistering burst of criticism. "It's way too boxy. It's got to be more curvaceous." But then he gave a resounding compliment. "It's a start," he said. Every month or so, Manak and Oyama would present a new iteration based on Jobs' previous criticisms. Jobs kept insisting that the machine should look friendly. As a result, it evolved to resemble a human face. With the disk drive built in below the screen, the unit was taller and narrower than most computers, suggesting a head. To be honest, Oyama later said, we didn't know what it meant for a computer to be friendly until Steve told us. Jobs obsessed with equal intensity about the look of what would appear on the screen. One day, Bill Atkinson burst into Texaco Towers all excited. He had just come up with a brilliant algorithm that could draw circles and ovals on screen quickly. Hertzfeld recalled that when Atkinson fired up his demo, everyone was impressed except Jobs. Well, circles and ovals are good, he said, but how about drawing rectangles with rounded corners? I don't think we really need it, said Atkinson, who explained that it would be almost impossible to do. Rectangles with rounded corners are everywhere, Jobs said, jumping up and getting more intense. Just look around this room. He pointed out the whiteboard and the tabletop and other objects that were rectangular with rounded corners. He dragged Atkinson out for a walk, pointing out car windows and billboards and street signs. Within 3 blocks, we found 17 examples, said Jobs. I started pointing them out everywhere until he was completely convinced. Hertzfeld recalled, Bill returned to Texaco Towers the following afternoon with a big smile on his face. His demo was now drawing rectangles with beautifully rounded corners blisteringly fast. At the calligraphy class he had audited at Reed, Jobs learned to love typefaces with all of their serif and sans serif variations, proportional spacing, and leading. When we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me, he later said of that class. Markkula and some others could never quite appreciate Jobs' obsession with typography. I kept saying, fonts? Don't we have more important things to do? In fact, the delightful assortment of Macintosh fonts, when combined with laser writer printing and great graphics capabilities, would help launch the desktop publishing industry and be a boon for Apple's bottom line. Although his focus was on the Macintosh, Jobs wanted to create a consistent design language for all Apple products, so he set up a contest to choose a world-class designer. The winner was Hartmut Esslinger, a German designer who was responsible for the look of Sony's Trinitron televisions. Even though he was German, Esslinger proposed that there should be a Born in America gene for Apple's DNA that would produce a California global look, inspired by Hollywood and music, a bit of rebellion, and natural sex appeal. Jobs offered Esslinger a contract on the condition that he moved to California. From then on, every Apple product has included the proud declaration, "Designed in California." From his father, Jobs had learned that a hallmark of passionate craftsmanship is making sure that even the aspects that will remain hidden are done beautifully. From Mike Markkula, he had learned the importance of packaging and presentation. People do judge a book by its cover, so for the box of the Macintosh, Jobs chose a full-color design and kept trying to make it look better. For Jobs, each detail was essential to making the Macintosh amazing. When the design was finally locked in, Jobs called the Macintosh team together for a ceremony. Real artists sign their work, he said. So he got out a sheet of drafting paper and a Sharpie pen and had all of them sign their names. The signatures were engraved inside each Macintosh. No one would ever see them, but the members of the team knew that their signatures were inside. Jobs waited until last, after all 45 of the others. He found a place right in the center of the sheet and signed his name in lowercase letters with a grand flair. Then he toasted them with champagne. With moments like this, He got us seeing our work as art," said Atkinson. Building the Mac. The journey is the reward. When IBM introduced its personal computer in August 1981, Jobs had his team buy one and dissect it. Their consensus was that it sucked. Bill Gates happened to be visiting Apple headquarters for a meeting on the day the IBM PC was announced. "They didn't seem to care," he said. "It took them a year to realize what had happened." Reflecting its cheeky confidence, Apple took out a full-page ad in the Wall Street Journal with the headline, "Welcome, IBM." Seriously. Throughout his career, Jobs liked to see himself as an enlightened rebel pitted against evil empires, a Jedi warrior or Buddhist samurai fighting the forces of darkness. Even 30 years later, Jobs cast it as a holy crusade. IBM was essentially Microsoft at its worst. They were not a force for innovation, they were a force for evil. They were like AT&T or Microsoft or Google is. Unfortunately for Apple, Jobs also took aim at another perceived competitor to his Macintosh, the company's own Lisa. Partly it was psychological. He had been ousted from that group, and now he wanted to beat it. Jobs' reluctance to make the Mac compatible with the architecture of the Lisa was motivated by more than rivalry or revenge. There was a philosophical component, one that was related to his penchant for control. He believed that for a computer to be truly great, its hardware and its software had to be tightly linked. In later years, Jobs' whole widget approach would distinguish the iPhone, iPod, and iPad from their competitors. Jobs' desire for end-to-end control also made him allergic to proposals that Apple license the Macintosh operating system to other office equipment manufacturers and allow them to make Macintosh clones. His approach meant